I feel it shouldn't be news my feelings towards Souls games if you watch my Elden Ring video, but if you haven't watched by any chance, let me give you a quick rundown. On this video, where I talk about my experience with Elden Ring mid-game and with the Soulsborne genre as a whole, I mention how even though I tried Soul games multiple times in the past, not just from Software but many other developers as well, I'd always hit a roadblock and immediately give up on them. Nothing related to difficulty, but more so other elements like losing points when dying, going back to bosses after defeating being long stretches of land with the possibility of losing health refills, and many more minor elements that added up to that. But once I started playing Elden Ring, that open-ended design really clicked for me instantly, and I learned and enjoyed my experience with it so much that my current goal is to, and I kid you not, play through all FromSoft Souls games and get their platinum trophies. On that note, it's really funny and sometimes bizarre how the third time's a charm saying seems to eerily ring true for most cases, and in this instance, I'm talking about Bloodborne. Bloodborne is one of those games I've repeatedly tried enjoying, but consistently struggle to progress through the game. The first time I played the game was with a borrowed copy from a friend. It was my first Souls game. I never heard anything about the series previously, and I was excited to play something new. I ended up dropping it, and at first it was because of the difficulty, or rather, the way I was approaching this game's combat formula. You see, my goopy goblin gamer brain had already been wired that in action games, every enemy in your path needs to be eliminated. But in Bloodborne, that only led me to my demise. I did manage to get to Father Gascoigne, but at that point it was too much of a roadblock, and that sinking feeling that I may never be able to finish the game got to me that I just dropped it. The second time was when PlayStation made it available on PS Plus back in 2018, so I installed it, tried the game once more, and this time I beat Gascoigne, and with the lessons learned from my first playthrough, I progressed further up until Old Yarnum, where I defeated the Bloodstarved Beast, and I was really enjoying it up until I found my next roadblock: progression. The thing that I didn't know about Souls games back then is how intricate the level design is, and how sometimes you'll need to progress in unconventional ways, such as talking with NPCs or acquiring specific key items from vendors to progress. In my case, I was trying to figure out how to get to Vicar Amelia, and instead of searching for a guide, I just looked at a playthrough on YouTube so I wouldn't get spoiled. And what ended up happening was that I got captured by those tall guys with a sack in their back, and I got transported to a jail cell located in Yahar Ghul, the unseen village, an area that looks really late game. And it's where I also encounter Dark Beast Portal, or as I like to call him, Electric Dogo, because of how fast and twitchy he gets, if you know what I'm saying. After roughing with him for some hours, I just gave up entirely and moved on, and it would be a long while until I touched Bloodborne again, up until a small indie game from a relatively unknown studio I'm pretty sure flew under many people's radar came out in 2022, called Elden Ring. One of the many beauties of Elden Ring is how open-ended it is, and how it's always giving you options and tools to deal with the obstacles put in place. For example, picture Margit, the Fell Omen, in the opening hours. He serves as the perfect tutorial boss to test how you'll progress through the game. Do you want to try hard and try beating him at level 1 with the little type of gear and items you have? Then go right ahead. Do you perhaps want to take a step back and explore a little bit of Limgrave to not only familiarize yourself with the place, but also level up and get stronger? You can. Or do you prefer calling the help of strangers online who are more than willing to lend a hand? At the end of the day, it's up to you on how you want to approach these scenarios, and while it's true that it could lead to some inconsistencies in terms of balancing later hours, that core philosophy of freedom never dissipates, and that right there is what made me gel with Elden Ring. I feel that was the perfect title to get me into Souls games, understanding the intricacies and how the formula generally works, which is a weird thing to say because I actually played and beaten Sekiro, but given how its tempo is marginally different to Dark Souls and Bloodborne, I eased into it more easily. So, Counting my experience with Bloodborne, Souls clones, and Elden Ring up until then, I decided to give it a shot once again, and wouldn't you believe it, it finally clicked. I was thinking into making a new save file and start fresh, but after noticing I still had my save file from my second playthrough, I picked that one up and along I went to experience what is undoubtedly one of the greatest games of all time. And I'm including the DLC as well. From the plethora of builds variety, the arresting gothic, Lovecraftian horror art direction, the music, the narrative, the atmosphere, and the sheer depth of hidden elements makes it currently one of my favorite FromSoft games, which is only rivaled by Sekiro, because that game is perfection. But back on point, this video serves more of a discussion of my experience instead of a formal review like I've done previously. So get some food ready and don't forget to keep yourself hydrated, because today I will be talking about my experience in rediscovering Bloodborne after giving up on it twice for quite an extensive amount of time. Remember when I mentioned how much I loved how open-ended Elden Ring is? One of the things that I learned from it is it doesn't matter how difficult or how greater of an obstacle the challenge may be, you can always find a way to cheese it. Of course, there are some players who rather do it in a more straightforward way, but what fascinates me the most in Souls games is finding ways to cheese, exploit, and making use of tools in unintended ways, and once again, you can always set the challenges according to your desire. If you want to make it harder or easier, you're more than welcome to do it. And for me, the said thing that actually made me stick with Bloodborne was the Come dungeon, and yes, you heard it correctly. If you're not aware, this dungeon is accessible with the chalices you obtain when defeating particular bosses, and to obtain the first chalice you need to defeat the Bloodstarved beast. Once you obtain it, back in the Hunter's Dreams, you can unlock the Chalice Dungeons, which is an interconnected deep underground labyrinth with depth layers where you can farm items or battle unique monsters and bosses not usually present outside those rooms and corridors. Not only that, but you can also input random codes to randomly generate a dungeon with all types of chalices available. YouTuber Xtrin back in 2020 made the funny discovery that if you input the code CUMMFBK into one of the tombs that give you access to the dungeons, you'll be greeted by a dungeon that offers 83,000 blood echoes per visit. And if you can combine the 3 eye runes to your character, which increases the amount of blood echoes you can earn, you can increase the number up to 143,000 plus, which is insanity. The way that dungeon works is fascinating, but I won't delve too deep into it, and instead, I'll direct you to this video from YouTube user Zuli the Witch, where they detail how it works in a simple manner. And as you can guess, I definitely made use of that dungeon to level up my character, but only to a point where I could still feel challenged, even though I now had a greater pool of health to manage. This ultimately led to the smoothest experience I had with the game. I finally dared myself and faced many of the challenges the game had to offer. And now, thanks to the dungeon with funny name, even though some of them were pretty easy to cheese through, some were incredibly frustrating, and yes, I'm talking about Mikolash, the annoying asshole that can't stop running away and keep spamming attacks. From a combat standpoint, Bloodborne marks the first shift in FromSoft's approach to its Souls formula, from a passive defensive to a more aggressive and immediate one. Even with this change, not every enemy can be easily defeated by just spamming them, and will instead require different tactics, which in turn allows it to maintain nuance when you also take into account the amount of tools at your disposal that allow you to tailor your own playstyle in these decaying streets. One of my favorite mechanics that came from this shift is Rally. Rally is a risk-reward mechanic that allows you to regain health by striking back at an enemy who struck you, and within its simplicity, there's such a large presence of adrenaline and rush that can often dictate your victory or defeat in exhilarating moments, especially during boss fights. What makes this mechanic the more anxiety-inducing is the multitude of weapons available and how its variety really set Bloodborne apart from other games, not just in weapon types, but how uniquely and unconventionally designed they are. On one hand, they vary from the typical swords, axes, saws, and spears, while on the other hand, you can sport a portable cartwheel, claws, and a chainsaw you can attach at the end of a metal rod. I know I'm trivializing some of these descriptions, but it's genuinely the best way to put an idea just how insane they are in concept and in execution. And that's not all, as these weapons all share what I might call one of the best game mechanics introduced in this genre, with it being the trick system. The trick system is one of the other radical additions introduced to Bloodborne, where the weapons essentially have a secondary mode or effect. For example, there's a cane you can turn into a whip, a mace that can generate electricity, a short sword that can be turned into a two-handed dual blades that excels in speed, and the list just keeps going. It's actually insanity how much both rally and trick play major roles in the game's combat design pillars, and how they ultimately shake up the traditional Souls combat structure, in turn making Bloodborne the most aggressive and proactive combat system designed at the time. It goes without saying how this wouldn't be a traditional Souls game without the inclusion of build variety through the many systems present not just in the combat structure, but exploration as well, mostly derived from the player's assigned attributes, whether at the beginning of a playthrough or at the individual ones you assign your blood echoes throughout your experience. In my playthrough, for example, I went with a build focused on strength and skill, the most generic as you can get, but it definitely benefited me when it came to using the trick system more than the regular mode. There's also something to be said about how the beauty of this system complements really well with the cooperative elements of the game, or any Souls game for that matter. Like, picture a boss that would be easier to beat with a certain build, opposite to yours. That wouldn't make him impossible per se, but you would have a harder time beating him. You could invite a friend or a random player to even the odds out, and there's a high probability their build may benefit you in said battle. It's those sort of things where the high amount of RNG and game balancing leads to a vast and varied experience not everyone will get to experience the same way, the way I see it. One of the things I've been loving while playing FromSoft games is how visually and intricately designed their visual identity and level design are. Elden Ring broke the mold a bit going open world, but you still got the dungeons and the individual locales when it came to intricacy. But when it comes to Bloodborne alone, that's majority of the game. And it's so beautifully structured, I got awestruck even in my final moments while working towards my 100% completion. As it is common with many other Souls games, FromSoft takes a lot of pride in how complex and intricate their levels are. I would call it a modern, maybe alternate take on the Metroidvania approach to level design, where the focus is not so much to reach a new area with a newly acquired equipment or ability, but exclusively to how its interconnectivity benefits backtracking to the fullest. Their levels are so full of secrets and shortcuts, it can actually be intimidating if this is somewhat your first game from the studio and you don't know what to expect. As I mentioned earlier, this was one of the reasons I dropped Bloodborne, thanks to the sheer confusion it was figuring out where to go without pulling a YouTube guide. But once I got familiar with it, it just felt like a believable familiar locale, and also a labyrinth in a weird sense. Like, if you've ever been in Europe, and just took your time to explore the streets like Lisbon's South area for example. It's just a mess of smartly designed streets with beautiful architecture where you just happen to find the most obscure cafes and thrift shops that in turn you can't help but smile and admire the amount of variety you encounter from 5 to 5 minutes. Racism and prejudices aside, it can be understated the influence H.P. Lovecraft left in the horror realm. Famously labeled as Lovecraftian horror, where his writing style places emphasis on the unknown and incomprehensible. Bloodborne at its core is a horror game, where much of its thematic underpinnings tackle the cosmic realm and how dreading and uncomfortable many abominations present themselves in this universe. Not just with the creatures, but humans as well, on how their curiosity, stubbornness, religious affiliations, superstitions, and curiosity more often than not leads them to their demise in the most disgusting and disturbing ways possible. What makes this subgenre really poetic in a way is, in the words of author China Mieville, Lovecraft's horror is not one of intrusion but of realization, in the sense that just the mere discovery or knowledge of a higher omnipotent force could send even the most hardened human being into a spiral of mental instability capable of damaging their sanity beyond repair. And it's not just the writing style, but the artwork representing these strings of words into visual entities. Most artworks depicting Lovecraft's world represent tepid and depressing environments, most times the European-inspired Gothic architecture birthed in the Middle Ages of Europe up until the 17th century, and usually on the horizon there's a large, looming monster of unimaginable size capable of striking down afflictions and other omnipotent-like curses that cause despair and hopelessness to those who come into contact with them. Similar to the amygdala in the game, which smartly ties that thematic I mentioned earlier through the insight system the games employ, where the more insight or knowledge in this case you gain from facing bosses or just consuming the madman's knowledge item, the more visual, gameplay, and auditory elements you start receiving in-game, like the doll at the beginning of the game to hearing a baby cry occasionally from any location. I'll admit that I don't fully know the intricacies of Bloodborne's narrative, but I have a general idea of what is happening plus the many lore interpretation videos present online I've watched. So I want to approach this section by talking about the broader thematic strokes present in almost every element, and I want to start with the bosses. It really speaks volumes how Hidetaka Miyazaki and his writing team beautifully strike a perfect balance between the horrendous nature and the sad circumstances when it comes to a boss in all of their games, and Bloodborne is no exception. Bosses like Father Gascoigne, Vicar Amelia, Ludwig, and so many more just happen to be the baddies impeding our way towards our ultimate goal, but the surrounding environmental storytelling and lore present exclusively for them ground these characters enough to the point a standalone game just focused on one of these individuals would be enough material. For example, Father Gascoigne is the first mandatory boss you encounter in the game, and he used to be a hunter as well until during the hunt pre-game timeline, he got afflicted with a plague, and slowly but surely it consumed him, to the point the little humanity he held onto slowly disappeared, turning him mentally more beast than man. With that in mind, let's rewind back for a bit. If you took your time exploring Yarnum in your first hours, then you most likely came across a little girl through a window, his daughter to be precise.
Who are you? I don't know your voice. But I know that smell. Are you a hunter? I just really look for my mum. Daddy never came back from the hunt, and she went to find him. But now she's gone too. I'm all alone and scared. Really? Oh, thank you. My mum wears a red jeweled brooch. It's so big and beautiful. You won't miss it. Oh, I mustn't forget. If you find my mum, give her this music box. It plays one of Daddy's favourite songs, and when Daddy forgets us, we play it for him so he remembers. Mum's so silly running off without it.
Once we accept the request, she'll give us a description of her mother, and she'll also give us an item. A tiny music box her mother used to get her husband's attention, which suggests it could be useful to find both of them once and for all. Now, moving forward, once we defeat Gascoigne, we'll come across a red brooch her mother wears, and from that point you start connecting the dots. One of the best aspects of Bloodborne is how certain story aspects seep into gameplay. And what I mean by that is how the most minute details that would generally go over our head have small but profound effects. For example, during the Father Gascoigne boss fight, if you play the tiny music box, it will momentarily stun and perplex Gascoigne as he internally struggles to fight his animalistic urges with his human sanity. And if you insist on using it during battle, it'll unfortunately come to a point where he doesn't get affected by it anymore, signifying his loss of humanity once and for all, before he ultimately gets struck to his demise from the short end of our weapon. Once the brooch is found, if you go back to her, you're given the option of either lying or telling the truth to her.
Miss Hunter, was it really her? Mummy, Mummy, leave me alone.
But no matter which outcome you'll choose, it always ends in her demise and those around her. And this is just one of the many other small stories spread throughout Yharnam, and it sums most of the tragic backgrounds these individuals face. Whether it's Vicar Amelia clutching her pendant, a reminder of what came before falling into beasthood, Mikolash descends into madness once he came into contact with a Great One, Rum the Spider, once a scholar at Bergenworth, that when coming into contact with Kos, a Great One, it turned them into a monstrosity that now they serve as a guardian present in another realm, shielding humanity from the true horrors bathed by the Blood Moon, and Ludwig, once an honorable hunter from the Healing Church, unfortunately succumbed to the bloodlust instilled by the plague, turning him into a despicable beast and forever banished to the hunter's nightmare. In classic FromSoft fashion, and in this instance, Lovecraftian storytelling, most of Bloodborne events started the moment us, mere mortals, came into contact with greater ones, and the basis of their presence in our realm without explanation triggers this insatiable obsession in trying to make sense of their existence. But so many ideologies and theories clash that it led to many institutions being established with the purpose of studying and examining with beliefs as basis, such as the Bergenworth Academy and the Healing Church, that due to their multiple clashings and experiments conducted, ended up triggering the downfall of Yharnam, with the use of the Greater One's blood, which unleashed the Beast Plague. It's for no reason you'll frequently hear the phrase, "Fear the Old Blood," as it brought much distraught to Yharnamites. This, of course, is a very oversimplification of the events prior to the game as we know it, and I strongly recommend checking lore channels such as Vati Vidya or my personal favorite, Tiptoe the Tank, where they have super in-depth and detailed explanations and interpretation of every single event that led us to the events of the game.
Lumatash? Oh, let's go!
Rest in peace. Na peace, de paz.
Conseguiste o troféu?
Eu nem sei. Consegui.
Let's go!
Canalha, pá.
Shame.
If you allow me for a minute or two, I would like to go into a bit of a tangent. Not towards the game, but just the general online discussion of Souls games when it comes to guiding new players into the series. If you're terminally online like me and most people who pay close attention to video game discussion online, whenever FromSoft launches a new game, the first question that always comes up is the difficulty. Now, to be fair, FromSoft games are purposefully difficult in their nature, as Miyazaki's game design philosophy is leaning to the difficult but not impossible template. But I can't help but think to myself how we wouldn't be having these types of discussions if hardcore Souls players were a bit nicer. And by the way, I'm not talking about the general community at large, but the small subset that the only advice they have to give is get good. I was definitely one of those peoples that avoided Souls games because of the difficulty talk, and I knew the difficulty wouldn't hinder me because I'm a very persistent person. But the way it was and has been talked about as this giant skyscraper-sized boogeyman that can't be defeated unless you're an elite gamer or something like that, that always threw me off. But that view changed once I beat Elden Ring, and that's kind of the beauty of beating a Souls game. Of once you finish one, you can beat the rest of the series. I guess my issue with this discussion is how Souls games combat encounters are framed as this only one way to beat it, and any other type of strategy would be simply cheating. The usual terms like skill and hardcore always come up, and it's genuinely discouraging discussing different tactics of a game that literally gives you so many tools to make ends meet in any way imaginable. And the general response to all of those are just ducking and dodging like we're playing dodgeball. Just like I described at the earlier portion of the video, I wouldn't have such a blast with Bloodborne if I didn't come across the dungeon with silly name, given farming is a big element and all. There's also the whole discussion of accessibility and how the inclusion of difficulty options would even the playing field, and I believe there is merit to that conversation. But after getting into grips with the series' design formula, I personally feel like Souls games shouldn't have difficulty options, as by itself it would feel very archaic when it comes to the storytelling themes these games have going for them, and the ways they intertwine with the overall gameplay, in which it could make the experience feel cheap to non-fulfilling. So personally, I think the best approach is making the difficulty scaling diegetic, and take Elden Ring's approach on how they structured it, where the large variety of tools, i.e. weapons, attributes, classes, objects, items, and many other elements, have the largest influence on how you tune your experience, whether you want to make the experience more or less difficult for yourself. Of course, there are some challenges when it comes to balancing all of this together, as it can sometimes make the difficulty pool inconsistent, but in terms of immersion, I really believe this is the best approach to take if a game can afford to do so. Of course, that should never be an excuse for inclusion of proper accessibility settings, such as visual, auditorial, cognitive, and many other impairments that can hopefully iron out some limitations on top of the already present difficulty. As a suggestion, I honestly think the best way to tackle this discourse is just welcoming different approaches to how people want to and play these games. Do you want to invite random people to help you out? Do it. Do you want to solely use magic to get past most hurdles? You're more than welcome to do so. And from that point onwards, the more we discuss and welcome different perspectives and different ways to tackle the many obstacles FromSoft puts in front of us, the more engaging the discussion becomes. And that's not to say that it isn't the current climate of the discussion sometimes. I just wish the more hardcore and vocal Souls fans welcome variety and accept the idea that not many people can beat the game the way they do it, you know? I'm not a big fan of medieval fantasy. I have some exceptions like the Witcher series, but that's because of the focus on characters and the dark twist it adds to that genre. And my lack of interest for the genre is also the same reason I wasn't really attracted to the Dark Souls series. From the outside, the general energy I got from them is games set in medieval settings, monsters to fight, go at it. But when Bloodborne got revealed, my curiosity peaked due to how different it looked and how striking and oppressive the atmosphere was from trailers and early gameplay footage. And I'm happy FromSoft made a radical shift, because in a sense, it really proved how well the Souls formula can be reworked and adapted in any different setting their games take place in, as both Bloodborne and Sekiro are living proofs of that. Having said that, after the many head slamming and rage inducing moments I had with Bloodborne, more than Elden Ring now that I think about it. It ended up being one of my favorite FromSoft games, and funnily enough, it is heavily tied with Sekiro, a game that I genuinely believe perfected the feel of real sword fights on top of the mystical and magical stuff going on. It's also kind of a shame that 7 years later there hasn't been a PS4 Pro or PS5 patch for the game, as a 60 FPS mode alone would have made the experience very transformative. There are reasons why a simple patch may be unlikely given how contractual obligations and scheduling play a role, but even so, at least I hope the remake or remaster rumors from Bluepoint are real, because when you look at the production values of Demon's Souls, another game I'm ready to dive into at some point, you'd know Bloodborne would be at its peak and its best form yet, until we get to the inevitable PS9 remake all over again, I guess. I'm genuinely happy I turned around to this game because all the featured boxes literally clicked for me: a striking aesthetic, solid combat mechanics, and an interesting premise, and after multiple tries, the third one definitely was the charm.